Hello, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to another Gadfly live stream. This is Carlos. Again, just when time permits, go check out our main site, which is the gadfly.vhx.tv. Appreciate you checking out there, our subscription-based multi-channel platform. We have the work of Jim Willey, London Paul, Ken Shorkin Jr. Very excited about the work that we do there. And today, I'm very excited to be joined by London Paul of the Series Report. So, Paul, great day. How are you, sir?
Yes, I'm very well, and obviously good day to everyone listening. And how are you, CJ?
Doing great, Paul. We started the conversation yesterday in regards to what transpired with, I think at first the Associated Press releasing the information in regards to the election, and I know we had a lot of celebration here in certain parts of the country, and the other part we had a lot of uncertainty, and people are looking for answers as to how to navigate through this. And I know that you've been spending a lot of time assessing some things, and I thought we could jump on a live stream and discuss those openly.
Yeah, look, I don't, as you said before we came on, I don't think we want to get bogged down in all what's the legal ramifications. Or there is absolutely no doubt to some degree, whatever that degree is, there is very questionable things going on in terms of voting patterns or whatever. And it remains to be seen if that ever comes to fruition, because the issue would be it might involve 5, 6, 7, 10 states. If it's one, that's a formidable challenge. If it starts to become multiple states, then I think it's just a legal bridge too far anyway. But the important point is whoever ends up as president, whether it ends up being Trump because some legal process enforces that, or it ends up with Biden, we need to sort of, I think, start to think, okay, what's the future for the US? Because there are certain very obvious things that aren't going to change no matter who's president. There are going to be some minor tweaks here and there, no doubt, certainly with respect to foreign policy, but arguably, what's fundamentally going to be different domestically, because of course it would appear that the Republicans will control the Senate, so that rather hamstrings a Biden administration, assuming that ever comes to pass. But I don't want to get bogged down in all the legality side of things, and because it is what it is, and whatever transpires is going to transpire, and chewing over what may have happened or did happen really isn't going to change the outcome. I think we need to, in terms of whether Trump remains for a second term or Biden, as things stand, is the president-elect. That doesn't mean we agree with it, but that's how things stand currently. Well, according to, some sources, Trump, as we know, has yet to concede, and there's an argument to say, well, why would he? And the truth of the matter is, even if there was none of this, I think Trump would be extremely loath to concede anyway. And that's not a criticism. I think for Trump, it's going to be extremely hard to let go of the presidency, whether it transpires that the illegality of voting was as big as some people assume it is.
Well, yeah, and Paul, I think it's important because, again, there's, millions of people who are paused right now and, waiting and thinking, hey, this will be decided in the courts. And as we stated before, there's obviously was some election fraud that took place. To the level it's uncertain at this point. But I think it's also important to understand that, like some of the conversations that we've had, and we don't have to rehash it all, but I think it's important for people to understand the difficulty that the current President Trump, was going through in regards to the massive amount of pushback. And that's something that a lot of people didn't understand. We documented, potentially not only through the LaRouche PAC and the Schiller Institute in regards to the military and the apparatus of the military-industrial complex, perhaps deciding that it was time for a change. We also dealt with over 3,000 companies, U.S. companies, who filed a lawsuit against the administration in regards to their trade tariffs. A lot of Americans aren't aware of this effort. We also had the associate with the National Chamber of Commerce, who came forth and resigned. And the main reason that he resigned was that he stated that the Chamber of Commerce had decided to, and that their lobbying efforts is just massive here in the United States. And that lobbying effort in regards to the Chamber of Commerce was to openly support Democratic efforts in all these states. So I think it gets confusing because people get stuck in their thoughts as regards to, this is who I'm supporting, there's no way this person's going to lose, but then they fail to assess and look at things at the other side in terms of the massive amount of uphill battle that was taking place. And then you counter that with the millions of people that did legitimately vote for a Biden administration. And you can't discount that. You can't discount that in terms of just saying everything is just absolute fraud. It's going to, it's going to turn over. So there were several, not only just individuals, people, but there were several institutional organizations that, for whatever reason at this time, that selected Donald Trump in 2016, decided it was time for a change, Paul.
Yeah, and there's just one small point with the issue of illegality. If Trump proceeds with this, which it looks like he will, he has to be extremely careful where he picks his battles, because if you start just having the scattergun approach, and it starts to get thrown out, then both the credibility and the strength of any case gets weaker and weaker with every state where the risk is it gets thrown out. And that's just one small point. But you're absolutely right. I mean, I've been very critical of Trump for a whole bunch of reasons. But yes, there's no doubt about it that a lot of the support he had in 2016 has waned. And I think it's pretty clear a lot of corporations don't support Trump. Significant elements in the military don't support Trump. The banking system, there's a lot of criticism of Trump. So really, he has a lot of things stacked against him. And there was no doubt about it, if you look in just very clear terms, that Trump had enormous rallies. There's no disputing it. And there's no disputing that Biden had next to nobody. But there is a slight flip side to this that says, well, how many people didn't turn up at rallies for Biden because they have this fear of the virus? I mean, and we can't rule out the virus process, where Trump, was very clear from his perspective as to what his idea of the virus was, and therefore that I think shaped a lot of his supporter view, which is why you get the paradox on the huge turnout at his rallies. And that's not to say that if there hadn't been a virus, you would have an enormous turnout at Biden. I'm not suggesting that. But this has influenced people's perspective. And whatever our personal views about the virus is, there is no doubt that has changed some people's views as to voting for Trump, because they didn't agree with his policy. Now, and I do think you can't just say outright, well, there's just Biden should have had 10 million votes or 20 million votes, and the rest are fraudulent. I don't accept that viewpoint. And I think a lot of people will have voted for Biden as a protest vote against Trump, because they were just fed up and went, well, I don't necessarily want Biden, but I don't want Trump. So what's the alternative in a two-party state system, effectively? Well, I'm going to have to vote for Biden, because otherwise, if I vote for one of the other smaller candidates, then they're not going to actually influence the result at the end of the day. So, that might be a dead vote, effectively. So, yes, I don't dispute this fraud, and it would be ridiculous to suggest there hasn't. But again, we have to have a balanced view as to what that means in reality. As Absolutely. I said, Trump overstretches himself. And I'm sorry to say, but there were instances where Trump was trying to prevent votes being, continue to be counted in like Pennsylvania, but he didn't seem to have a problem in other states where he thought he could win. That weakens this argument also, because you can't have this idea, well, if it benefits me, I want it to happen. If I think it's going to be damaging to me, I don't want it to happen. You have to be, consistent in your approach with this. So, and there was elements where, people, effectively, Democrats were encouraged, because of the virus, go and have postal votes. Trump seemed to actively encourage, Republicans not to use postal votes. Well, maybe if he'd actively encouraged them as well, that might have helped his cause. So there are certain things you can't dismiss in this equation. But at the end of the day, wherever we come out of this, whether Trump manages to make some legal standing stick somewhere along the line, which is debatable, but let's assume he does then, and then he has a second term. Okay, what does that mean? And then the flip side is, well, if Biden does become president-elect and is inaugurated in January, what does that mean? But as we said before we came on air, the mere fact that Netanyahu goes on Twitter effectively, supporting Biden is extremely telling, because for a fact there's an enormous Israeli lobby in the United States, which I'm assuming is supportive of what Netanyahu said. And Netanyahu's effectively nailing his colours to the Biden mast now, and is effectively thrown Trump under the bus as a result of this. And we can talk about other world leaders who've done this. I mean,
Yeah.
But I think that has far more gravitas than any other leader in doing this. And, when we said, well, there was an indirect tweet from Pence going, well, we support all legal votes, but he's not actually come out and retweeted specific comments Trump's made. And it's almost like he's kind of slightly doing the politician thing and distancing himself from Trump as well. I think Trump's been left more isolated than ever, and because politicians will hedge their bets and they'll go, well, do we really want to take the risk of damaging our credibility? And therefore they're likely to say, well, okay, let's just sit on the fence, or hedge our bets, because we don't want to go down this route and then find the whole legal process fails and we were supportive of it, because that might damage our future career politically. So that's probably as much as anything why we're seeing that. But the Netanyahu statement, I think, is very, very telling.
Paul, I'm glad you mentioned that, because that was one facet of the uphill battle I completely forgot to mention, was the establishment Republican Party also moving forward and saying, hey, look, we've taken a lot of damage. We're not certain what this is going to look like. So therefore, he has the inner workings of the Republican Party, who are more than willing to begin the process of parting ways with Trump, navigating through this. Paul, I just want to touch base. So you're absolutely correct. The courts is going to be left at this point to decide what that's going to look like. What people have to understand is that the courts, for the most part, are supposed to be nonpartisan. They will look at actual substance things if there's proof, and it can't just be that somebody said this happened here or this. That's just not how the courts operate. So I'm just being a realist in regards to that. One of the things I'll share it again, and I say this quite often, is that I'm very much a realist in my reporting, and I don't call something that I don't see. I think it's when you go to speculate and regarding information, I think you should clearly state that I'm speculating. I have no proof of that. It always doesn't work that way in the alt media, which I think we can talk about for just a minute. But what we do know on the surface is that judges in 2 states already have rejected the campaign lawsuits as they continue to try to push this claim. Now, I know everyone's going to say, yeah, but that's the media that's saying all that. But at the same time, it's the judges that rejected that. And if you have a situation where you have an election, and again, at this point, it looks like it's pretty concise, unless there is fraud in these 14 or 15 states in every state, then the Supreme Court itself is going to have a difficulty even taking that case up. And will they touch it? Will they look at it and say, hey, you know what, we're gonna counter what millions of people voted and go with our opinion on this? I don't see that happening in my best opinion. I don't. But what concerns me the most as well, Paul, and where I do want to touch base on this is that, and people listening in may not be aware of this. I guarantee there are people who are tuning in that are listening to this. And to me, in my opinion, this is a dangerous narrative, is that the fraud that occurred in some of these states, the potential fraud was done on purpose as a operation to capture these people who committed all these election fraud. We have some even in our media space, people, that we respect, that are pushing this narrative that this is all being planned, that there's these mass arrests that are occurring in the background right now in all these states of all these people. And I just, again, I want to apologize on those people's behalf that are reporting that, because it's just leading people through a path that's simply just not true, Paul.
Well, where's the evidence? Look, I mean, the whole mass arrest thing. I've heard this story recycled since 2002, and then every few years it gets recycled. And there was around 2008, unsurprisingly. Then there was a big push around 2012, 2013, and then when Trump got elected, it was, it's been pretty consistent news, for basically 4 years, and there's not a shred of evidence of this. And maybe one day something will happen, but the point is, it's not happening. And you have to reach a point where you go, how long am I going to keep hearing this before I start to say, hang on, where's the substance to this? And because, if we'd spent 4 years pushing a certain angle, well, actually, if we'd spent 4 weeks pushing a certain angle, we'd be castigated for it. But there are other people, for whatever reason, who, keep repeating the same thing, and it never happens. And I don't understand the rationale behind it as to why that's the case. But anyway, we have to deal with things of substance. And the point is, and I keep making this point, if there's some big grandiose plans that are playing out in the United States and elsewhere, which is all about taking the deep state down, whatever you want to call it, are we seriously supposed to believe that this huge plan is going to play out in the alt media? So people in the alt media know something that the rest of us don't know, but apparently the deep state don't know that they don't know it's happening, even though it's playing out in the alt media, and they seem to know everything about what's unfolding. And if there really was a plan, no one would know about it, because it's the last thing you would know that would be in the public domain. But apparently it's in the public domain, and everyone thinks that makes it justifiable. Well, that's a bit like going, very simple terms, going back to World War II and publishing all the plans of how they were going to defeat the Nazis, and putting it in the public domain and going, well, there's the plan. I mean, it just doesn't work like that. That is not realistic. And I just find it staggering how anybody actually sits there and goes, well, yes, that makes sense. And that's a viable route to give people all this comfort that something's going to happen. But apparently, this secretive plan is so unsecretive. It's out there in the public domain. I mean, if that was the case, you wouldn't give, whatever people's perception of the deep state is, you wouldn't give them even a breath of understanding that something was going to happen. And again, there's all the talk about ballot papers and watermarks. Well, my understanding was every state prints its own ballot papers, and there's multiple companies that are involved in printing ballot papers. So again, these stories just don't seem to. For me, when you start to scrutinize something, they just don't stack up. And I fear it's just the whole process of conditioning people to believe, there's this solution, all these wonderful things are going to happen. Just keep believing in something, and there comes a point. Well, okay, let's just assume Biden becomes president elect and is inaugurated in January. Well, what then? I mean, then it's that whole thing's over. It's finished, based on the assumption of what everyone believes. So I don't want to get too bogged down that, but it's an important point to make, because we've spent a long time saying there's no evidence to support this, and we've been completely correct. for the entire Trump presidency. Now, maybe, we'll see something different in the future and then go, okay, now there's some substance behind these claims, but thus far there isn't. And I mean, we were told there was big emphasis on the fact that everything was in place. There couldn't be any chance of voter fraud. Trump was going to walk the election. Then Trump doesn't walk the election for whatever reason. And then there's another, convoluted story to explain why that didn't happen. Well, how about going back a few weeks ago and hang on? But it was our understanding that everything was in hand. There wouldn't be any risk of voter fraud. Trump would win the election rather easily. And it's like people just seem to have a very short-term perspective and don't reflect back on years and years of promises. 3 years ago, Hillary Clinton's going to be arrested. Well, that never happened. So why aren't people reflecting on endless promises made that are never delivered? But I mean, I think that's probably enough to be saying about that. But it's an important point to make.
Yeah, it is, and indeed. There's also a great article. We can't share this article on any social media platforms because they pretty much have been blacklisted. So anytime you try to print or share a link to either Facebook or Twitter from the uns.com, it automatically gets blocked. So, but there is a good breakdown and assessment on their review. They pointedly call out Jared Kushner in this, which I guess in some part has some truth to it, some not. You can even go back and listen to Roger Stone, who I know a lot of people don't like Roger, but however, he is very, his dynamic of understanding elections and how they work. And he, in my opinion, a brilliant mind in regards to that. They made a Netflix movie, Get Me Roger Stone. He doesn't always play by the rules, but he was even openly a little bit critical of the Trump campaign and how they were managing their funds, how they were leveraging, what they're aiming and their targets were. And there's some very interesting statistics in this data. And one, I think that, just completely kind of flips the narrative in regards to, Trump being any type of a racist or anything like that. Because when you look at these election results, Trump picked up a significant amount of votes, with the Latinos, with the African-American community. And crazy enough, within this data that you find out, Paul, is that where they misunderstood or didn't estimate enough was the change in white America. And that's the fact that, Trump lost, that was the significant, that cost him the election was in the white, primarily men that didn't vote for him that, either changed their mind or for whatever reason decided that, hey, we're flipping this narrative. So there's some statistical data that you can take a look at. And the UNS, in my opinion, is pretty balanced, like in their reporting and what they shed light on. So for those that are just saying, again, the only reason I'm stating this because everyone that's saying, hey, this is all just completely election fraud, that's all it is and everything. I think you have to think a little bit different and don't get stuck in that, because there is reporting like this. It's breaking down the numbers and taking a hard look at the data to show exactly where some of the gaps were in this campaign, Paul. And again, this is factual data once again, which we take a lot of pride in, that we report, again, things on the surface.
Yeah, and I think it's worth mentioning this. It's entirely likely that the economic fallout of what's happening in the US may have influenced people's voting. And there's a kind of strange paradox to this, because there could have been people who would have voted for Trump, but actually were, believed Trump's, attitude towards the virus, but didn't think Trump was hard enough in pushing that agenda that's caused them, to have economic problems, lose their jobs. Where it's not actually the other way around, where it's like, well, Trump was imposing all these kind of policies with regards to the virus that the Democrat side were definitely hammering a lot harder. I think it's actually just the fact that they believe Trump's attitude towards the coronavirus, the pandemic, but you allowed these things to happen, which have caused huge job losses, because you allowed the country to be shut down when it shouldn't have. So there's that kind of flip side. And as ever, there are so many permutations. There's so many different variables, and at this stage, it's impossible to break everything down. But the trouble with partisan politics is it tends to make people to become very one-sided. So, if Trump loses the election, immediately, voter fraud's a thing. Now, that's not to say that, of course, there is some definitely irrefutably that's happened, but to what degree? But that's the immediate narrative to jump to, is because I can't accept the fact that Trump's no longer, well, potentially at least, or no longer president, or won't be sitting president for a second term. And that, for me, that's why, for me, the whole partisan politics thing, I think, we're at risk. I mean, it's very emotive. People are very, very highly charged on both sides of the fence. And I mean, the people who vote for Trump are very passionate, for Trump to win. And then the people on the other side of the fence, are just like celebrating, like, it's the greatest thing that's happened in US history to see the back of Trump. And that's, you've got these very polarized people with very intense attitudes to things. And that at times, whatever side of the fence you want, can draw us into conclusions, because we want to believe that's the conclusion. And ultimately, I think there's a lot of belief that, oh, well, Trump will definitely turn this around, and due process will happen, and it'll all work out fine. Well, these are the same people who've been railing against the judicial system for 4 years, complaining about how flawed it is, how much it's failed, why it's not undertaking due process, which is true. But suddenly, miraculously, this same judicial process is all going to come down on Trump's side. Well, again, those things don't stack up. But that's the emotive side, because there's a lot of people who think, well, if Trump isn't re-elected, it's game over for the United States, or some people think it's game over for the world. I mean, which of course is simply not the case. And yes, there is undoubtedly going to be differences between a Trump administration and a Biden administration. But the overarching thing is the United States is going to collapse economically. Its financial system, the end of the dollar as the world reserve currency. It doesn't matter who's president. That's going to happen. And, from a lot of Americans' perspective, the word socialism, the US is going to have socialism on steroids, whether it's Trump or Biden. These things aren't, going to be miraculously different. So in that sense, I mean, yes, I'm not disputing that certain things will be different. And there might be some tweaks in US foreign policy, very slightly. But fundamentally, not a huge amount's going to change, because bearing in mind that Trump, for whatever reason, didn't make any of the changes that was my understanding prior to him being elected. You got to bear in mind, I was aware of the fact he was going to stand for the presidency before it was public knowledge. As it was said to me, he'll stand to be president and he'll win, provided whoever they are, don't kill it. Mm-hmm. Okay, Trump subsequently became president, but there was a big expectation of all these changes he would make. And okay, again, this isn't a criticism. He's just failed to do this. None of these things have happened. And that's, as much as anything, that, he's trying to turn this enormous oil tank around on a dime, which is impossible, for one individual to do this. And that's why the idea another 4 years of Trump was going to change everything. Well, there'd have to be some pretty enormous changes for that to come about as well. That people think just saying, oh, a second term means this, without actually asking the question, well, why can we suddenly turn this proverbial oil tank around on a dime when we couldn't do it in the first 4 years? Those obstacles are still in place. But I think, again, that's another important consideration, that, people can be very passionate about politics, but for me, setting the Trump, equation in this whole proceeding, doesn't matter who you vote for. The same government or the same interests control the United States, and it's big corporations. It's the military-industrial complex. The things like that. They're the ones who have the vested interest to to make decisions that, of course, benefit them. And that's another reason why the idea that they planned the collapse. And I want to emphasize this point again. The rationale behind why people think it's an engineered collapse is because they believe the West can never collapse. It's impossible. The dollar can never disappear. The West will always reign supreme. And therefore, when a collapse happens, well, they must be engineering it because we can't rationally explain it any other way. Well, no, they were always going to collapse. I mean, I've talked about this for a decade and even longer. In fact, first in 2007, when it was very obvious what was coming in 2008, and it was very obvious they wouldn't make the right decisions. So this isn't suddenly this bolt out from the blue. You know, it wasn't like we had strong economies. It wasn't like the dollar was strong. It wasn't like we didn't have all this massive debt, all these massive unstable banks. I mean, you know, all these things were already there. We've seen it for years. So it's no surprise, but apparently it's a surprise because the West can't capitulate. Well, the West is capitulating, and this, you know, pandemic, for whatever reason, is accelerating the collapse of everything, including big corporations, including the banking system, including, you know, ending up where it's causing massive inflation, or it's going to, in the mainstream, which they managed to avoid for a decade. And that's the other point. They spent a decade preventing the collapse, and then were suddenly supposed to believe there was an engineered pandemic involving nations who despise the United States, but they're going to play along with it, or the West in general, and they're all going to play along with something. Well, the whole narrative falls apart, and when we accept the fact that the Western Empire is in its final days, and that encompasses not just the United States, and this, I think, is a good move into what happens domestically in the US going forward, whoever. But, you know, this affects Europe, it affects the United Kingdom, it affects all the Western nations and all the vassal states of the United States and beyond. So this is a huge challenge going forward. And, you know, and there might be politicians out there looking at this on the Republican side going, well, do you know what? Do we really want to be the incumbent party effectively with Trump as a president? Because we know the capitulation's coming. You know, maybe, you know, we have 4 years of Biden. He's never going to have a second term, or we can pick up the pieces in 2024 because they have a long-term perspective on this. That, you know, because the truth is, if Trump was to have a second term and all the capitulation happens, that you can guarantee the Republicans are not going to win in 2024 or even 2028. In fact, it might be one of those things that leaves a very sour taste in people for years. So there'll be people thinking this way, that, you know, maybe it's better we're not. You know, we don't have a president, as it were, or a Republican president, for want of a better word, which I don't think Trump ever has been, really. But then, yeah, I think it leads into the issue. Okay, what's going to happen domestically in the US, you know, as a result of, you know, what we know is coming, and whether it's Trump or Biden really doesn't change the picture greatly. I mean, it tinkers with it a bit, but not hugely.
Yeah, Paul, you know, we mentioned this earlier, and I think it's just, you know, very telling, and I think we should circle back to it just real quick, and that's in regards to Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu congratulating Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. And I think for the most part, it's important to understand and to give Trump credit for his efforts in regards to what he has done to try to curtail some of the foreign intervention policies that, you know, whether it was the disruption of like North Korea when he tried to extend a hand there, or working with China, the disruption that occurred. But at the same time, it was fade at people. The disruption occurred primarily because of the people that he put in place. So I'm not sure why this is coming out now. I know that Netanyahu and Trump just celebrated this historical peace deal. Maybe he's not. Maybe the Israeli lobby is not so happy that we're selling weapons to the UAE, and it kind of ties into in the direction that you were going in regards to the aftermath of, regardless of who's in effect. And I do have a little bit of a fear, because I know that there was a major push for an escalation with Iran, and I just pray and hope that people understand that, regardless of who's in office, that any type of escalation, whether it's with Venezuela, Iran, anyone, just doesn't make sense. But this is some of the danger that potentially could lie ahead for the United States.
Iran's well, it's a very, very difficult, complicated subject. And really, we have to go back to the Obama administration to try and make some sense of this, because if we think about it, it was the Obama administration that was responsible as a major architect of the JCPOA, which the Trump administration walked away from. So there's an argument that says, well, Biden's part of something which the Israelis were very unhappy about. They weren't happy about the JCPOA, and they were really thrilled when Trump decided to walk away from it, which, as we said, was, a very, very foolish move. He should never have done that, because it weakened the United States enormously. But anyway, it is what it is, and we are where we are. He's already suggested, which may mean something or nothing, that Biden said, well, we might decide to rejoin the JCPOA, which actually, if they did, would anger Netanyahu greatly. That doesn't mean he will do. It doesn't mean, in any way, shape, or form that the US will actually end up doing that. Because what you say and what you actually do are often very, very, very different things. So, do I think there's a risk of war with Iran? No, I don't. I don't think that there's any real risk that will happen, simply on the basis that the stakes are way too high. And what I can say is, numerous times through the Trump administration, the US military prevented Netanyahu wanting to have preemptive strikes on Iran. So I don't think that's going to change, whether Biden is president or Trump. I mean, we know for a fact during the Trump administration, at the 9th hour, they pulled out of missile strikes on Iran. But then, unfortunately, Trump was the president when they assassinated Soleimani, which was equivalent to Iran assassinating Pompeo. Now, absolutely ludicrous policy decision. So, I mean, it's always natural to think another administration, the risk of Iran, but I think Russia's made the position very clear with regards to Iran. So I don't see, and I've never seen World War III coming, because at the end of the day, this whole idea of mutual, self-destruction is not something any nation wants, and the military most certainly doesn't want it. So I don't see that to be a problem. There's a kind of really bizarre paradox here, because you might see with the Biden administration a much even hard, if it's even possible, to have a harder line with Russia, just because they're going to have to follow this through because of all the whole Russiagate bullshit. I mean, if they're suddenly softer, people go, hang on, you made a big play about this Russiagate nonsense, and now you're backing away. With regards to China, they may take a softer line, possibly. Because again, it's one of those situations, there are elements to Trump's foreign policy which you could arguably say, how much control did he have? So how much of this was his making? I mean, I think with regards to North Korea, definitely. I think when he made it impromptu decisions to meet Kim Jong-un, that wasn't a policy decision, from elsewhere inside the Beltway or the administration. That there's no doubt. And we know for a fact that Bolton's, scuppered any sort of rapprochement with North Korea. And now you might as well say it never happened. I mean, you'd have to literally go back to first base to try and deal with North Korea. So it's very complicated to know to what extent some of the policy decisions with regards to the US's position was Trump, or was it, influenced by Trump? Was it Trump sold his aim? I mean, the obvious one being removing troops out of Syria. There was also the issue of taking, military personnel out of Afghanistan. And then ultimately, of course, the big fly in the whole ointment is Pompeo. I mean, if Pompeo ceases to be part of the equation, that could change things. But then there's rumours that that Biden might bring Dick Cheney on board. Oh, God.
Oh, dear
I mean,
Lord.
if he does that, my goodness, that's an extremely bad move. I mean, we'd absolutely savage Biden if he does that. I mean, that would be crass stupidity on every level, and potentially a lot worse. So you can never really tell because of Trump being in and being a wild card president. How much was he involved in foreign policy decisions? How much was done because of him or in spite of him? And not all of that's particularly clear. I mean, there's no doubt he was hoodwinked about chemical weapons attacks in Syria, for example. But why he was persuaded to kill Soleimani, it beggars belief. I mean, that showed a level of naivety that from Trump's perspective. I mean, if you or I were sat there as the president of the US and said, "Well, actually, I'm thinking of killing Soleimani," you just go, "What are you doing? This is insanity." So, I mean, it is complicated. I mean, I think you'll see some tweaking of US foreign policy, but but we also have to have the flip side that the US has been extremely aggressive with China, and trying to stoke a war with Taiwan. And this is during the Trump administration, there was also threats to start a war with North Korea. Now, the question is who was responsible for that? And then we, of course, had all the rapprochement with Trump going to see Kim Jong-un, and they had 2 meetings. So that you could see as a positive side. Well, without Trump, does that mean they're going to revert back to the old, very aggressive stance rather than this passive stance with North Korea? So it's complicated to assess what will happen. Yeah, I don't expect you'll see major changes, but if he does rejoin the JCPOA, and then the argument might be, well, Netanyahu's not going to view that very favorably. In which case, what happens to the Biden sort of Netanyahu relationship there? Or it might be they've got some idea that if they rejoin it, then they can then go and destroy it from within. Well, anyway, that's we're totally speculating. So then I think we have to come to domestic policy, and the dollar's going to go when the dollar's going to go. The US economy is going to collapse when it collapses. The financial system will implode when it implodes, and there's nothing a Biden administration or a Trump administration can do to change any of that. I mean, it's like the situation. Whatever's done now is going to accelerate the collapse. The Fed can go and print trillions of dollars. That doesn't solve anything. It, in fact, makes things worse. Or, as they're trying to do now, say, well, we need to cease really having the emphasis on monetary policy, and now it's down to the government, it's down to the Treasury. We need fiscal policy. You have to print trillions of dollars and deal with the consequences. Well, that in itself creates enormous problems. Not least, eventually, it's going to cause major inflation. But those things are going to happen. So the argument would be, okay, in the short term, what is going to have to be done for the American people in order to stop the American people almost having a kind of revolution, for want of a better word? Because if you have a situation where, and it's the same in the UK, and they're panicking here, trying to say to people, well, you can claim these things, make sure you claim these things. They're extending furlough schemes, they're doing everything because they're panic stricken about people losing their jobs, and if it turns into tens of millions, then it's a major problem. Well, if you start to seriously impact 100 million people in the US, etc., you're going to have major problems. So the question is, to what extent are they just going to keep printing the dollar into oblivion to finance everything, not to prevent a collapse, but just to try and stem the collapse from, at least in the short term, from the average American's perspective. And I don't think the policy decision will change that much. I mean, okay, you might argue that we're back to pretty much, even if you had a Biden president, where we were with all this negotiation for another fiscal stimulus bill, and the Democrats wanted, I don't know, something ludicrous, and the Republicans were going, oh, well, 500 billion, and the Democrats wanted 2.5 or 3 trillion. But eventually they'll have to reach an agreement, and that nonsensical bipartisan nonsense will give way to reality. But at the end of the day, they'll just have to keep going through with this, and there's no sort of way out of this. There's not some magical policy decision that will change it. So then the question is, the average American who says I don't like socialism will be begging for socialism, because they'll be like, well, it's the difference between me starving, in metaphorically or maybe literally, or not. So then all bets are off, and then it's like, well, we need to ensure that we need to have sort of fiscal protection from the economic carnage, because there isn't going to be any miraculous improvement. And you, before we came on, you made the point, well, are they going to have additional lockdown measures in the US? And I mean, one thing I think that would be materially different would be a Biden administration's handling of the virus. They will do things very, very differently, which will have probably, well, not necessarily the end result of the economic outcome, but it will short term have far more serious implications, and maybe an accelerant, but the destination remains the same.
Yeah,
so and that's ultimately, I guess, where, when you get to the end of where this is going to be, then really the picture's not going to radically change. I mean, and in some ways, we come back to this point. Eventually, some US administration, whoever it might be, whether it's now, in 5 years, or, but I don't think we'll ever get to that, but they're going to have to sit down with the Chinese. They're going to have to sit down with the Russians. They're going to have to sit down with the rest of the world and go, okay, things are different. We have to hold up our hand and admit the world's a very different place now, and the US has this dominant powers over, the dollar's over. Okay, what are we going to do in the future? And to have rapprochement with China and actually meet them halfway and start to try and develop a relationship which will benefit the US going forward, because they're going to need the Chinese in some capacity, even though a lot of Americans, that may stick in their throat, and in fact they might feel revulsion in even thinking that. But this is reality. This is where we're going, whether people like it or not. That is that you cannot switch off from China and pretend they don't exist, pretend that their resurgence as a major nation is a reality. You have to accept it and work with it, and rather than fighting them or fighting everything, just say, okay, we have to accept that the world's different. We're not going to be an hegemonic power, and but we can be a great nation amongst equals, as I've said. Okay, what do we do to make that happen? And at some point that is going to have to become a reality. Now, whether that's Trump or Biden, the sooner it happens, the better. Is there a paradox that the Biden administration might be a little bit more receptive to that? I don't know. I mean, there's a little side of me that thinks possibly, but maybe not. Again, it's this situation. What's really driving this China policy? Are we going to see a major change? Is this a real Trump initiative, along with other people who've been driving this because they decided they wanted to grind China into dust, and they weren't prepared to accept this? Well, it's not clear. Or maybe a Biden administration might change that, in which case that was a very hard and fast Trump wildcard president initiative. If it is, then we'll see this big change, and that might actually help being able to move things forward and actually have a less of a major impact on the US going forward. So again, there's going to be these external factors that are going to drive internal policy, but I guess fundamentally the biggest concern for me, and it's been like this, is the massive polarization in the US. And whoever becomes president, whether it's Trump or Biden, has to do something to glue the nation together, to heal very deep-seated wounds. And do I see that at the moment? No. There's no evidence of that. And if the US wants to make progress, apart from the internal damage a deeply divided nation that's collapsing would have for everybody, it's also in everybody's interest, because it might help to accelerate the US's move out of what's going to happen, and lessen the blow and the burden on people in the longer term. And that's the most fundamental thing. You have to have something, whoever is president, to galvanize the people. And I'm not suggesting Biden will do this, but I just don't see Trump doing it in any way, shape, or form. Is he going to have a second term and go, look, we need to galvanize the nation? I don't see that. I mean, the one thing he has done, which was part of the thing, was he distanced himself, and he very much set his goal and said, right, I'm on this side of the equation. And he got massive support. And that was why I think more than anything, he got voted in 2016, because he was this wild card who was totally different. People said, well, he's not part of the political system, which he isn't. And they looked at him when he's a great option. And because he can do something different, or he potentially can do something different. And I think that was where, and I think that wore off with some people in the course of the last 4 years. But I think policy decisions this year to do with the economy, etc., actually ultimately has impacted Trump to some extent. Okay, and we've gone full circle back to what's the extent of the illegality in voting, and we don't know, and we can't quantify that, and maybe the legal process will unearth that, if assuming, of course, it even happens.
Yeah, it's going to be very, very interesting dynamic when we look at the current political landscape. Obviously, we look, United States is very divided as a country. Thank goodness within the federal government, we still have, for the most part, a divided legislature, which it actually, I think, plays to benefit at this point, just in terms of the ideas. Joe Biden in particular, an individual, as crazy as may sound, I think that he will be forced an attempt to, govern a little bit towards the middle. I think where the risk is that we know that there is a far more progressive base that's going to be really, advocating and pushing him for a lot of these social programs. You will see every attempt to basically, ignite the massive amount of debt that the federal government will be there. The question is, will the Republicans be there on the conservative base to keep the spending in check, which we know is bound to happen, whether it's the funding of the Green New Deal, which which is definitely in their crosshairs as far as getting that initiative done. And we've seen that before, by the way. Obama did that, and it led to massive amount of companies spent in solar and all these alternative energies that they just completely, fell apart. I'm a firm believer that it needs to be individuals and businesses that drive those, not government driven type industries. And that's just on the spending side. But then there also is a concern as we navigate through this as well in regards to Biden, potentially, with his health. He is obviously will be the oldest sitting president in the United States. Is it, in the event that something does happen to Joe, what does it look like with a President Harris, and where she has seen some alignment with some more of those really hard progressive Democrats pushing for, a lot of those social programs. So there's a lot of uncertainty, at this point, Paul, in regards to what it's going to look like legislatively within the federal government as we navigate through this. One other perspective that I think it's going to be important for everyone to understand, and it's why I really, and you said it best, Paul. We messaged back and forth the other day. Said as much criticism that we did for Donald Trump, we're going to do the exact same thing with Joe Biden. And for those tuning, those tuning in, you're going to hear that. You're going to have just open assessment on what we, same thing that we did with Trump, where we were openly criticized when we need to be, and applaud his efforts and when time needed as well. But the same thing with Biden. And I always stated that I think the most dangerous thing to our republic, and that is managing through the executive office and the executive orders. And I warned about that when people were saying, yes, more executive orders and do those. And you can celebrate those things when your guy is in the Oval Office, but you can't have the double standard and support those things. But then when someone else is in the office and they're also directing and managing the country through those executive orders, that's the danger. That's the item that we're going to have to really keep an eye on, because if Joe can't get things done through the legislative part, then he will be pushed from his own base to legislate from executive orders.
Yeah, and I want to make a point. If and you make some great points there, CJ, with regards to social programs and spending which looks great in principle, which be absolutely farcical, and and achieve and spend lots of money and achieve nothing. And with regards to Biden, if Biden does an eighth of what we suspect he might do, and put it this way, whatever critique I've done of Trump, I have a funny feeling I'm going to be far more savage in my critique of Biden, and that's simply because we have to assess what each president does. I have no interest in partisan politics. It's been nothing but a useful tool to divide and conquer whatever nation you're in. So yeah, I have no hesitation whatsoever. Well, like I say, if he brings Cheney in, that is an absolutely ridiculous. It's just imbecilic decision to make, and that will say it straight off. So I'm not. I think sometimes because predominantly we've done via Rogue and of course Gadfly, my own podcast. It all came during the Trump administration, a lot of it on a public forum, and therefore it appears as though we're just savaging or criticizing Trump. Well, if it is Biden, my goodness, Biden will be under a microscope and we will savage him. And if they do rule by executive order, and you make a great point there that there is a big risk because of the fact that he won't have control of the Senate. So they could introduce ridiculous policies, and no one's going to reduce spending. I mean, the Republicans certainly weren't, and there's no indication whatsoever. In fact, the risk is you'll see even more ridiculous, bloated budget deficits and more ridiculous spending. The only thing is, of course, is that these social programs are going to see massive spending in Main Street again, which is going to have enormous consequential effects. It's not going to be stuck inside Wall Street or inside the banks. So, and no one's going to buy the debt. So what are they going to do? Just they're going to have to turn around to the Treasury or the Fed and go, well, we need $2 trillion for some programs. Well, we're just going to print it for that reason, and so there are inherent problems in them achieving those objectives. But if they're just going to spend trillions of dollars to make themselves look good with no end product, which is very, very likely to be the case, then we're gonna savage them for it, and justifiably so. Because at the end of the day, my critique of everything with regards to the US is, I want the US to be a great nation for the American people. And I'm not going to stand there and support someone just because they're on one side of a political divide. If they're wrong, they're wrong, and it doesn't matter who's wrong. And ultimately, there are many things that Trump should have done, was supposed to do, which would have changed the whole perspective globally in terms of how the US interacts, how the US weathers the loss of world reserve currency status, and all the other things. And for whatever reason, he failed to do it. Where he made bad policy decisions and brought people like Bolton in and Pompeo and people of that nature, who we should never have done. Were very bad policy decisions. But I guarantee that if Biden does become US president, I can guarantee by mid-February we're going to be talking about Biden in very savage, critical terms, and of that there is no doubt about it. And there is, I do have, as much as we're fearful of ridiculous, rampant spending going on with it, because there's no choice but to do that, really, as far as US domestic policy is concerned. I do think the Biden administration will try to take it to a whole new level, and they'll justify it on the grounds, well, there's this economic collapse and there's things happening. But I actually come back to the point, I don't think anybody really inside the Beltway is grasping the gravity of what's really coming here. Because if they were, they wouldn't be doing the things they're doing. Yep. And therefore the argument's going to be, when things get as severe and as bad as they are, they're going to have to face some extremely difficult situation where they're going to be totally out of their depth, irrespective of what administration's in place and irrespective of what the real drivers in government are. And I come back to the point, a lot of these real drivers in government sense, in terms of corporations, are already looking away from the United States and going, well, the future's bleak here. They seem to have a better grasp, but again, it's that thing where if you don't believe the West can collapse, then you're always looking for an answer, or you just simply refuse to accept that the day of the dollar as the world reserve currency is over, the day of the US being what it was is over. And really, that's, if we accept that because it's reality, then we need to start asking ourselves far more important questions. Okay, well, who's going to fill the vacuum? What's the future? How long is it going to take for the US to get back on its feet? Rather than saying, well, it must be engineered, therefore there's all these nefarious plans afoot that are going to, and all these hideous things are going to happen to us. But by the way, if Trump's in office, they won't happen. Well, that simply isn't the case. There isn't all these hideous, nefarious things going to happen. And B, it doesn't matter whether you've got Trump or Biden in, because Trump would not prevent it even if it was a reality. And because we come back to the point, if they were to roll these things out as people increasingly believe, are we really seriously going to imagine that? I mean, if you want to galvanize the American people, that's the one thing you would galvanize the American people on. When they see the government or whoever directly attacking all Americans, that's the one thing that's going to pull the American people together faster than anything else. And does anyone really imagine that's the one thing they'd never do? Because when you pull all Americans who forget their political allegiances, forget all their differences and their ideologies, and go, we, the American people, are under attack here, they're going to do something about it. And that's why that reality is not a reality. And I think part of selling it to the American people this way was a way of going, well, that's why you need to vote for Trump. Because if you vote for Trump, this won't happen. Well, if you vote for Biden, this is definitely going to happen. Well, the reality is it's not going to happen in either case. But I mean, that doesn't negate the fact that the US and the UK and mainland Europe and everywhere else faces enormous challenges. We need to accept that those challenges are coming. And the only way we'll get around it is when we go, I don't give a damn whether you're Democrat, Republican, I don't give a damn whether you have a Christian belief or you don't believe in God, or you're atheist, or whatever your ethnicity is, or whatever. We just forget all these ridiculous things to divide us and go, we are a nation of people and we need to work together and forget these differences and realize that we have to work collectively. And I fear, as I said, I've said this before, and I don't want to labor it too much, but until we reach absolute rock bottom, I think that's only them, all the people, realize that they're going to have to collectively work together to change things. And unfortunately, we shouldn't have to see everything collapse for that to happen. But I sadly think that's what will end up happening before we do that.
Yeah, and exactly what you said, and Paul, again, I'm not it's very interesting to hear Biden state this during the debate. And he makes a few gaffes every now and then, more often than not. But it was interesting to hear them say this, and I want to discuss this just for a little bit. I'm going to play this clip real quick.
Okay.
Fellow who told you this is going to end by Easter last time. This is the same fellow who told you that, don't worry, we're going to end this by the summer. We're about to go into a dark winter. And he has no clear plan, and there's no prospect that there's going to be a vaccine available for the majority of the American people before the middle of next year.
President Trump, your reaction, he says...
I think that's enough right there. And in part, I think that dark winter that's approaching, there are signs all around us, right? The lockdowns in the UK, the lockdowns in Germany. We're seeing this globally impacted. And, for the most part, we didn't do that here in the United States. But when you look at the reporting, Paul, they continue to escalate the numbers of positive cases in regards to COVID-19. I did a search on the internet. What I couldn't find is the actual benchmark and the gauge of increase in tests that are being processed on a daily basis. I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but here in the United States, literally almost every drive-through pharmacy here in the United States, it seems like there's one on every other corner, are doing COVID tests. The schools are mandating, universities are mandating random COVID tests. And so, yes, the case numbers are significantly increasing, but what they don't tell you is like how many tests are being completed on a daily basis. And what you stated in regards to, hitting that rock bottom point, my fear is as we navigate through this and Biden openly discusses the dark winter that's approaching, I think it's very telling potentially of what could be coming to the United States, even potentially, in the next 30 days.
Yeah, I mean, with the irony with regards to the UK and the coronavirus, and I will talk about this just very briefly, is the government's now it's rolled things out, and the argument is why are they doing it? And because again, it's they're testing massive amounts of people, so they increase the case numbers. What's the fatalities and hospitalization? But the reason they've done it now is because they're going, well, hopefully, if we do it now, that means people can spend Christmas with their families, because they're absolutely terrified. If they say to people, you can't spend Christmas with your family, there is going to be anarchy. There's going to be massive civil disobedience on some level. And again, the problem with all this is I completely understand why people are very skeptical, because everyone has a right to be distrustful of governments. I don't trust Western governments. I don't trust the UK government, but I don't trust them for very different reasons. I don't trust them because predominantly they are absolutely clueless in what they're doing. And I don't want to get into the whole Brexit thing, but if knowing what they're not doing, what they should have done 3 years ago and haven't starting, is crass incompetence. And the problem is, because of all this, people again are going, they can't. Again, it's that the West can't collapse. And they surely can't be that incompetent. They must be doing all this deliberately. Well, no, it's just a completely crass reaction to a problem. And part of why they're suddenly going crazy about testing is because they looked at China and went, well, China has a few cases and does millions of tests to make sure that it doesn't spread, because they've got very, very densely populated cities. Shanghai is just one example, Beijing, etc., etc. And they're kind of half imitating what China does, but actually completely in a crass way that is of no benefit to what we're doing. And the problem is that it just fuels people's fear and anxiety as to what's going on, and somehow there must be a nefarious plan for them to be doing what they're doing because they can't be that clueless. Well, I'm far more concerned about how clueless they are, because as they're being clueless about Brexit, that's going to have serious consequences by when Britain leaves. The other thing is, when everything collapses, they're not going to have a clue what to do in terms of how do we address this problem? What are we going to do to start to turn things around for a nation? Where are the people in government who have the capability to know what to do? I mean, we've said this with Ken before, and it's back to, we don't have a, for want of it, I mean, not literally whether, you have a Putin, but you need a Putin type person who is not, it's not about, a dictatorship as people think Russia is, or anything, but you need a strong leadership who goes, right, we have massive problems. We need the greatest minds in this country, be it the US or anything else, to realize what needs to be done and start to put some plans in play and make it non-partisan and just say, look, this is not a partisan issue anymore. This transcends politics. This transcends all previous understanding of anything. All that sort of political bullshit has to go out the window. And we don't have those people. So, but you're right, you make the point is that that whatever the fallout of the election with the US, whether it goes to court, whether Trump has a second term, which I think if he does, I think he's going to have even more monumental problems than he's got now to circumnavigate. If it's Biden, okay, it is, for all the reasons we've discussed, there are serious concerns about that, and I'm not pro Biden. I said all along, I don't want either of them. But if you had to choose, then Trump would be a better option. I don't see any good in a Biden administration, not least as you mentioned. How long is Biden going to be president? And before I think he ceases to be president under the 25th Amendment, and Harris subsequently becomes president. And what does that mean in a broader context? So, but yeah, Biden's comments I think are interesting. I mean, I think once there's a confirmation, once the hope from the Trump side is either realized or is evaporated, we're going to start to see ramifications from that. We're going to just see this ongoing real economy collapsing, the reality unfolding, the US role on the world stage diminishing, and just this whole thing imploding as it is. And what are the consequences for that? And this is another reason why this transition period for me is farcical. I just don't understand why if you have a government, if the government's in today and it's not tomorrow, don't have this transition. Now, a transition could be beneficial, but also whoever's leaving could just throw a few, incendiary devices into the equation just to make things extremely difficult, just as a final parting shot, which ultimately is detrimental to the American people. In this case, I think, like you do here, and if it's Labour one day and Conservative the next, then the Prime Minister's out, the new Prime Minister's in. They go through all the formalities with the Queen, and then they form a government and they take over. And I don't think you should have this transition. But anyway, that's just a personal viewpoint. But
Yeah.
yes, we are in very challenging times, and until we get to the bottom and we hit rock bottom, then we're just in this grind. And how long does the grind last? Well, no one's got a crystal ball, but the virus has accelerated the grind, and it's accelerated the collapse and of the collapse that has been tried to be prevented happening for over a decade. So it's not an engineered collapse. We out in the West have to start facing a very uncomfortable reality that this collapse is happening. It's not engineered, and we do not have the people capable of providing the right level of governance, the right level of decision making to know what needs to be done. And where are these people? I don't doubt there's some wonderful people in the US and the UK and elsewhere who could slot in and make great decisions. But who are these people? Where are they? And because they're not part of the political system now. That I'm not saying everyone in the political systems, but there are some notable exceptions in the UK and the US, but they're few and far between. And we need to start dealing with that reality and saying to ourselves, okay, given the severity of what's coming, we need to forget the things that have been used to divide us. And we need to come together and go, okay, it's not a war literally, but have that wartime mentality when nations forgot their political differences. They forgot all that and realized there was a common threat. Well, the common threat isn't Nazi Germany this time. The common threat is all the problems we're going to face economically, financially, and societally. And we have to get into that mindset. And that's the one thing the alt media should be, that's the one thing they should be talking about and broadcasting and getting people to galvanize and come together. And it just doesn't happen. Okay, we do our best to try and do that, but we're in a very, very small minority because most of them are very polarized and very partisan in some way, shape, or form. But ultimately, all that partisan politics will be of no benefit. As we keep saying, doesn't matter who gets voted in, particularly given what's coming, because the whole system will implode. And therefore, the question is, who is going to be there to galvanize the people? Who's going to be there to actually make policy decisions and make the right decision and actually grow up and go, Russia and China aren't an enemy. No one's an enemy. We all know that we're going to have to work together because the world's a very small place. And in the future, it's going to get smaller and smaller and smaller. It's not going to get wider and bigger and nations becoming more isolated. It's going to be the other way around, whether we like that or dislike it, because technology is going to make the world smaller and smaller.
Very well said, Paul. Very well said. Paul, I think that closes it out for this session. I want to thank you for a great discussion. Before I do that, is there anything else you'd like? Is there anything else you'd like to close out with?
Well,
don't feel the pressure. I know that. Go ahead. Good.
No. Let's just see what happens with regards to the legal challenges, if they come to something or they don't come to something. But at the end of the day, let's just ditch all this party politics crap and go, we're Americans or we're British or we're German or Dutch or whatever we are. And as a nation, we need to come together for a greater good and realize that we're never going to solve anything in our nations until we do that. And that's the biggest challenge we face, is to ditch all these things that have been used to divide and conquer us. And that really, I think, what else can you say other than that?
Yeah. Yep. Absolutely. Absolutely. I want to also thank all the people tuning in, and also our Gadfly subscribers. If you're not a current subscriber, please consider doing that. Again, you can jump over to the gadfly.vhx.tv. And you can sign up for a free 30-day trial where you'll get podcasts similar to this. And then as well from all the contributors, Ken Shorten Jr., Paul, and also Jim Willie. And then also, please don't forget to jump over to Paul's main platform, which is the seriesreport.com, where you'll get great articles. And then also about his premium content, which are his daily podcasts, of which I subscribe. So, Paul, thank you for a great discussion. And I'm sure we'll be doing this. I'm sure we'll be doing this real good again real soon.
Yes, I'm sure we will.